Welcome to Palabra Reclaim. Thank you for joining us. I'm Valeria Fernández, and I have to introduce myself because I'm the new managing editor of Palabra and so excited to be here with you today. This is an opportunity for us to highlight the work of other Latinx journalists, and we have a special guest today. Her name is Tina Vazquez, and she is the author of The Incalculable Cost of Cheap Chicken and the Hidden Industry That Shoulders It. This is an investigation that was recently published by Type Investigations in partnership with Scalawag, which is part of the URL Media, a fantastic group of different media organizations, which Palabra is also a part of. Welcome, Tina. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you. It's an honor.
Well, before I invite you to talk a little bit more about the investigation, I want people to know more about you, and I will read them a brief, not so brief bio. I think it's so important to share these things, especially with an audience of other journalists and Latinas. So Tina, she is currently a senior staff writer at The Counter, where she reports on gender, labor, immigration, and food systems. Previously, she was a senior reporter at Prism, a women of color-led nonprofit news outlet centering the people, places, and issues currently underreported by national media. There, she reported on gender justice, workers' rights, and immigration. And prior to Prism, Vasquez was a senior reporter at Rewired News, where she built out the first beat, this is so awesome, to the national outlet dedicated to covering reproductive injustice in immigrant communities. She was the Southwest Fellow in Type Investigations 2020-2021 Ida B. Wells Fellowship, and a member of Pointer's 2021 Power of Diverse Voices Writing Workshop for Journalists of Color. That's an awesome workshop. She is also the recipient of the 2018 Planned Parenthood Federation of America Media Excellence Award, a 2015 Media Consortium Impact Award, and she is also an alumna of the Voices of Our Nation's Arts Workshop. And I'm excited she's working on a book for the New Press about reproductive injustice in immigrant communities, in the immigration system, actually. And I hope we get to talk about that towards the end. Tina.
Yes.
Well, the pandemic was this very unique moment in which everything that wasn't working right came to the surface, especially when it comes to injustices in communities of color and for immigrant workers and those populations. Tell us a little bit about the heart of your investigation on these chicken poultries, big companies. We all purchase chicken that comes from probably one of those places.
Yeah.
What was particularly different or came to the surface during the pandemic?
Yeah. I went into it kind of naively, which I feel embarrassed to report because, for decades, people have covered the injustices in the meatpacking and poultry industries. But, COVID started to unroll in the US, and like everyone else, I was kind of looking at the news and seeing these hotspots, the first hotspots in the US form in poultry and meatpacking plants. And because I like to do local reporting, I started to wonder what this looked like where I live in North Carolina, because I knew that we had poultry plants in rural areas, and I know that it was predominantly Latino workers who worked at these plants. And so that's really how it started. I was at Prism Reports at the time, and I just started calling people that I knew in the area, like immigrant leaders, folks that I did stories on before, and I was asking them questions about, if there's a story here, what does it look like? What are you seeing in your community? And I did some kind of limited reporting for Prism, mostly interviewing immigrant women in the poultry industry who were telling me about the conditions that they were seeing. That lots of their coworkers were getting sick, but the plant wasn't telling them anything about who was sick. And if they came into contact with someone who was sick, they didn't have access to to information in their language. So they were watching Spanish language news and learning about outbreaks in the place where they worked. And so I did a few pieces about it. And then this fellowship opportunity came up, and it seemed like a really good fit to kind of have the time and the resources to do a much larger investigation, because the theme that kept popping out to me was this kind of two-tiered worker system. So if you look at all this poultry reporting, nobody really talks about the role that staffing agencies play in hiring undocumented workers to work in these plants, and then they're treated a fundamentally different way. So with that understanding, I wanted to see how COVID complicated that dynamic in plants.
Yeah, tell me a little bit more about these staffing companies, because I think some of us seen them in other areas, maybe for, cleaning businesses. I think, there was a case with Walmart was hiring a lot of their employees through these staffing companies so many years ago, right? And different other companies use them. What kind of environment? Well, first of all, tell us how the staffing work, how the staffing companies operate,
Yeah.
and they kind of work through these loopholes, allowing the bigger companies to hire undocumented workers.
Mm-hmm.
And then second, what does it mean in practice for the rights of those workers?
Yeah, that's a really good, big question.
Yeah.
So you're right, like this exists everywhere, right? In construction, in agriculture. So in poultry here in North Carolina, what I realized was that, so you have, the company I was writing about was Mount Air Farms. So Mount Air Farms has plants in North Carolina. And if you have work authorization, or if you're a US citizen and you want a job, you can get hired directly by the plant and you get those benefits that they offer. You make between $14 and $16 an hour. During COVID, you got hazard pay in some instances, right? But if you don't have work authorization, or you have papers that you're using to work under an alias, you can't go directly through the plant. And so some of these like the staffing agency I wrote about, I could not confirm that they had like a physical office space, right? So people would tell me this company NipCam, it's through word of mouth, or people who worked at other staffing agencies would say, I got recruited on Facebook. This guy told me to go to this carniceria and apply and I could get a job at the plant. So according to the owner of the staffing agency NipCam I was writing about, he said, yes, we verify that they can work with the papers that they give us, which I thought was a very interesting way to phrase it. So kind of everybody knows what's happening, right? Like Mount Air needs workers. It doesn't necessarily want to take on the responsibility of directly hiring undocumented workers. So the staffing agency plays this like intermediary role where it hires the undocumented workers to work at the plant. And so it's technically a joint employer arrangement, but it's so confusing and murky that I would talk to workers and they couldn't tell you who their employer was, right? They couldn't tell you anything about the staffing agency. It was unclear like what the chain of command was, who, like some workers literally had to look at their pay stub to tell me the name of the company on their pay stub when they worked at this place. And so that has really big implications for their lives because they get paid significantly less, right? Of course, they don't get health care. There was some things that workers told me that was very hard to verify because Mount Air would not talk to me at all. So like all kinds of small indignities, like in the fall, Mount Air Farms gave backpacks with school supplies to its workers, but it didn't include contractors, right? Or these immigrants who were employed by staffing agencies. Or when they had an injury or they didn't feel well at the plant, the staffing agency bosses there dissuaded them from going to the nursing station, or they didn't feel like they could go to the nursing station the way that direct hires could. And during COVID, they didn't get hazard pay and they're paid significantly less anyways. Like a lot of the workers I spoke to made around 11 and some change, whereas direct hires at Mount Air Farms were making between $14 and $16 an hour. And then, at the center of the reporting was this injury. A worker named JG is what we called him, and he had fingers on his hand amputated. And it was, to me, I thought of that as a really serious injury, right? But then you realize things like this are happening at plants and we don't know about it. And unless I got these records, I wouldn't have known what happened to this man. And I still don't really know what happens when you become disabled that way. And if you're undocumented, like what becomes of your life and your ability to make a living,
Exactly. And there's a few more things about the way that the workers were telling you they were being treated that I want to touch on. But talking about the injuries, which is so important, you also find out through this amazing work of public records requests how there is a bit of a lack of reporting, like a bit of a limbo there, where the staffing companies are not quite reporting in the way that they should when these injuries happen. So it's sort of a vacuum. Can you explain that, and how do you find out?
Yeah. So these stories are so hard to report because it's once you know it, you see it everywhere, right? But like proving it is hard. So even I was able to get the contract between the staffing agency and Mount Air Farms, which then the owner of the staffing agency was like, that's not our contract. I don't know what that is, but it was his contract. And so I was shocked to learn that it's not that the staffing agency is a client of Mount Air Farms or the poultry company. It's actually the other way around. And Mount Air Farms is the client of this staffing agency. And so, yeah, I mean, when this staffing agency, NIPCAM, had a history that I learned through records of not always keeping track of injuries that workers had sustained. I believe it was in Maryland many years ago, around 2012, that an OSHA investigator went to their office that they had and asked for these logs where you keep track of serious injuries and deaths. And the woman who worked in the office didn't know what the OSHA investigator was talking about, had never seen those logs. And so, of course, reporting on this company now, that gives you pause about what is logged and what isn't. At Siler City in North Carolina, at this Mount Air plant, I was able to obtain records related to injuries, and there were serious injuries, like crushings and amputations, and notes in OSHA records about how workers maybe aren't being trained properly to do these very dangerous jobs. I mean, the records really helped tell the story.
Yeah, and for the journalists that are listening, where do you go? There's so many places where they can probably follow up with different industries with this. What were some of the key governmental agencies that you did these FOIAs with? And did you really have to push for them, or surprisingly not?
Covering immigration, I went into this being like, I'm never getting these records, because when you cover ICE and DHS, it's like you make a request and it goes into a void. I was shocked that that wasn't the case here. So if you go on like the federal OSHA website, you can look up specific staffing agencies, specific poultry companies, and you could see the list of like violations, investigations that have happened. There's no records there, but it lets you know what to request. And so I did that for NIPCAM, and I saw that they had records of violations in various states and quite a few in North Carolina. And so I submitted a records request that was very broad to the North Carolina Department of Labor, thinking nothing would come of it. And I got thousands of pages of records. I found the agency to be very responsive. And I don't know if I should say this, but in the most important set of records that were kind of at the center of the story of JG's amputation, they accidentally gave me the list of names that were redacted in the file. And so I was actually able to verify the names of managers and other people at NIPCAM and Mount Air that workers had been telling me about. It was like another piece of evidence that like, I know who these people are and I know what's happening here,
That's amazing, especially, for verifying. And for those in the audience that are not journalists, I mean, this is all the work that goes behind the scenes to fact check our research. So it's like extremely important. In the case of JJ, I think that was during pandemic times, right?
2019.
No, that was in 2019. But there was something also that happened with President Trump. And before we go there, I want to read the beginning of your story because it connects with us, the consumers buying the chicken. Just to let it think for a minute. The average American consumes more than 100 pounds of chicken meat annually, or 8 billion chickens a year nationwide. It should come as no surprise then that as the pandemic unfurled across the United States a year ago, poultry disappeared from store shelves as panic-stricken Americans hoarded food in response to reported shortages. While Americans turned to cooking during unprecedented times, there was a human cost for discomfort. I feel that that beginning encapsulates a lot about the story, and how it also, oftentimes we're missing the link. It seems like audiences don't see how some of these issues could connect to them, or how we're a part of the whole chain. Um, During the administration, because of this demand, President Trump, um, I think he passed some sort of measure that allowed these poultries to, and you will be able to explain this better than me, to speed, do things faster, right, in the line of production. And that could cause a lot of problems and more injuries for the workers. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah. Where do I start? It was just profound. So I, was in communication with undocumented workers whose existence and ability to work is criminalized, but they were given this piece of paper by their plant saying that they were an essential worker. So if they were out and about during lockdown and for whatever reason they were stopped by law enforcement or whatever, they had this piece of paper that said, I'm allowed to go to and from work. So you have documentation in this sense. But every other way in which you don't is criminalized, which I thought was striking. But then, yes, with the line speeds, I was in touch with a woman named Luce, and that's all I know of her name, right? She was very afraid of repercussions at work. She was an immigrant worker at Mount Air Farms. And we were in touch for over a year, mostly via text, sometimes phone calls, whatever she felt comfortable with. And when they increased the line speed, I believe it went from 145 to 175 chickens a minute. And she was describing chicken at her plant in Lumber Bridge, North Carolina, the Mount Air Farm plant, of chicken falling on the ground, that workers could not keep up with this unbelievable speed and they were getting injured. And it was just like a breakneck pace that was not at all sustainable, and especially because people were gone or they weren't feeling well, because in some instances they were sick and they got COVID. Just kind of like a nightmare atmosphere, and that was their daily job, just to crank it out while this was happening.
And also, it was also the problem of the inability, really, of social distancing at
Yeah.
that, working in that pace.
Yeah.
So Maria Isela Martinez, who was hired by the staffing company NIPCAM Services of North Carolina, right?
Mm-hmm.
She was a instrumental person in the story, and I really appreciated that you have a paragraph in there talking about the stakes for those who came forth with their full names, or even anonymously. You never know if someone finds out that you're talking. The stakes of being persecuted by ICE, facing retaliation, losing your job. And she sort of did, because not because of the story, but because she was outspoken at that time. Tell us about, more generally, when you approach a story like this, how do you sort of compromise with the stakes, and helping the people that are sources understand the risk they're facing? But at the same time, for you, I mean, it is hard
Yeah.
knowing the stakes for your sources.
Yeah, it's terrifying. And with this story, that was hovering over me the whole time, because we had those huge raids in Mississippi at the poultry plants. And we've had raids in North Carolina under the Trump administration, not at poultry plants, but at other workplaces with large immigrant workforces. So that was, I never wanted the takeaway of this reporting to be they're hiring undocumented workers. I don't care about that. Undocumented people need jobs. What my issue was how they were being treated and how little they were being paid. But telling that story in that way is very complicated, because it's not, I don't demonize the staffing agencies for employing undocumented people. That's not the issue here. And so how do you do that in a way that's safe, that doesn't put a target or a spotlight on people, basically by saying lots of undocumented people work here? It was a constant back and forth and conversation. The draft went through many, many iterations, and we removed a lot of sensitive information that I verified with workers, are you sure? Are you sure? Are you sure it's okay to do this? Including Maria Cela, and she would say yes. And then we just had to have lots of hard conversations about whether that was actually wise or safe, But yeah, in reporting very sensitive stories, I have like a very direct conversation with people where I say, there's no telling how this reporting will move in the world or who it will get in front of or what they will do, so I want to be clear that I will do everything humanly possible to keep you safe and protect you. But there are things I can't account for, like whether that's online harassment or you get fired. These are the stakes, and you can remain anonymous or you can use a pseudonym. But should anybody find out, like, there's a chance that somebody can find out that it's you, or that there are things that we can account for. And so then we have a contingency plan sometimes, which is like, if they threaten to fire you or your colleagues, we can write a story about that. We can continue mounting the pressure. And I don't know if a lot of reporters are comfortable working in that way, but for me, it has to be reciprocal. Like, what are you getting out of this other than a target on your back? So I want to keep people safe, and I want them to feel like they're collaborating in the reporting and getting something out of it. So with like Maria Cela, for example, I would give her information. I would be like, do you want to see these Mount Air records? Do you want to know what I learned about NIPCAM today? Do you want to know about what I learned about how the company is structured? And she could share that information with her coworkers, just for their own benefit, So I've kind of learned over the years how to walk the line, but it still doesn't always feel comfortable, and it's still really scary. Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I can really appreciate you sharing that, especially about the giving to the sources. Because sometimes it's just, so much about taking and painting this doom picture and not really seeing people as the advocates that they are for themselves.
Yeah.
I mean, Maria Isela was pretty outspoken.
Very. Yeah, she does not hold back. And we had a final conversation when we were getting ready to publish, and I was like, are you sure? Are you sure you want to use your name? Are you sure? And she was like, I always tell the truth. She just wouldn't back down. And I was like, oh, I'm not going to be paternalistic about this. Like, cool. Like, if you're cool with it, then I'm cool with it,
Yeah, no, absolutely. And a topic that has come up in lots of conversations, last year, this year, for journalists. Journalists were humans too. And I'm asked this question a lot. How through this process and with all this responsibility and trying to minimize harm, and I know that like your heart is for these people, is to not cause them harm, quite the contrary. How do you practice self-care, or what were some of the things, if you did any, or how do you fail?
Yes. No, I love that question. I wasn't always good at taking care of myself during the pandemic. In this report, so working on reporting like this, where the stakes are high and you have like daily reporting, right? It just felt overwhelming. And then there's a pandemic, and then it's hard to concentrate. And so being kind to myself and understanding like, it is what it is. If I can't get this done today, or being real with my bosses and being like, I don't feel well, like I'm not managing all of this right. And then taking the time to do things that make me feel human, like gardening or reading or going on long walks or cooking or reading cookbooks in bed. Just trying to remember that I'm a human too, and that if I'm like, I have lots of other responsibilities in my family, to my father, to my nieces. Like, if I'm not taking care of myself, I can't do it all, So it helped me learn to kind of prioritize some of the stuff that helped me stay sane.
Thank you so much for your work, for doing all this work, because I know last year was a particularly hard year, and people like you really put themselves with passion on doing these things, and it it is a big thing, and so hard to to separate, as you're hearing what's going on in the news, and what every single soul in the planet is impacted, and you as a journalist, this is no longer a story happening elsewhere. It's also playing in your life. So I want to get us a little bit off the investigation to talk about something that to me is really interesting. And it's your book that you're working on, and I think it is interrelated because it is about justice also. And could you tell us a little bit more about why you decided to work on the book and some of the things we might see and where you are at the process?
Oh, I feel like it's so scary to talk. So I signed the contract for a book almost a year ago, and I'm working on the same chapter. My editor is very kind. I've been like, I don't know, I'm a mess. It's hard to do all these different things. But so my first staff job ever was at this website called Rewire News. And basically we covered abortion access, but like broadly reproductive health, rights, and justice. And so I was hired there to cover immigration. And I think that was really confusing to people. Like, what does that even look like? But there was more than enough to write about. So like around 2015, early on, writing about, deportation and detention as family separation, or using the reproductive justice framework to think about immigration. Like one of the central tenets of that is the right to raise children in safe and sustainable communities. So if you are undocumented and you're being targeted by ICE, that's not a possibility, right? So thinking about immigration through that lens, the book just kind of fell in my lap. Another reporter that I adore and who helps me a lot behind the scenes told the New Press about my beat, and they expressed interest in it. And so it's broadly about what reproductive injustice looks like in the detention system, but also outside of it. I think when we saw the family separations at the border, that might have been the first time that people thought about immigration as reproductive injustice or what happens in that system. But there were lots of other situations, people being sexually assaulted in detention. You flee gender-based violence in your home country only to experience it in the immigration system. Mothers who are separated from their newborns. I wasn't able to always know what happened to their newborns if you have to give birth when you're detained. There was just so many stories that I didn't think got the attention that they should. And that was a beat I was covering. So I thought it could be helpful to put it in book form.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. I think that, I look forward to this work, and understandably it makes perfect sense that you've just like finished this big investigation. You have your daily, like at what time of the day are you going to be working?
I only have so many words, in me.
Right. Exactly. I know. And, just to wrap it all, for a lot of journalists, it's difficult to get the support and the time to work on this big investigations. And maybe for the book, you need a fellowship, you need to apply for like something that you can go off, take a break for a while. So yeah, how do you go about trying to get this support? Because it's hard, you knock on many doors and you get rejected, and you might get disappointed. You have a few tips for journalists out there who would like to say, look, I want to fully work on an investigation about this industry or this topic, and I need the time.
Yeah. Oh gosh, that's hard. Fellowships, of course, are always an option. I have found that they could be pretty hard to manage when you also have a full-time staff reporting job. And so what I would say is to be very clear about your parameters and the time that you need, right? So just because you get something doesn't mean where you work will let you carve out the time. So like having an explicit conversation about what you need in order to do that work, I think is really important. I've since learned about book leave, which I did not know was an option. What else? I found mentorship really helpful, like informal, like sometimes getting connected with someone you don't know very well can be awkward and you don't know how well you will hit it off. But I have found other Latinas in the industry who like you're friendly with are so generous with their time. They've saved me time and time again, whether it's like reporting conundrums or figuring out how to find funding, because that's another thing. There are lots of opportunities out there for like no strings attached funding, just I need it for this investigation, and you can apply, and as long as you submit a budget or something like that, you can get the funding that you need to do the work that you want to do. It's just a matter of like knowing where to look, and that's why I have found like that kind of informal mentorship with your friends who've been in the industry super helpful to me.
Yes, yeah, I absolutely agree. And I hope that we can stay together, in touch, and
Yes,
that
please.
I can reach out to you for mentorship.
Yes.
And hopefully we also will see some of your work in Palabra in the future.
Yes.
We actually will see it because the story will be available. We will have a link to it on our site. And and I think there is a Spanish version. Va a haber una versión en español coming up for those of you who want to read it in Spanish, right?
Yes, it's going to be published on Migrant Roots Media in about 5 days, I think.
Perfect. That's awesome. That's awesome. So the story is The Incalculable Cost of Cheap Chicken and the Hidden Industry That Shoulders It by Tina Vazquez, co-published with Type Investigations, Scalawag, which is part of URL Media, where also Palabra is part of that family. Tina, do you want to say anything else? Do you want to add something?
Thank you. No, thank you. I mean, it's always like, I don't know, it just fills me up, like I get so nervous doing, I don't know if other reporters do, but doing media is like your nightmare because you're used to asking the questions. But talking to other Latinas in the industry always makes me feel like, whew, I'm not alone in this. So just thank you for having me.
No, thank you. And yeah, you're certainly not alone in this, and we all appreciate your work. Muchísimas gracias. And for the audience, we look forward to seeing you again in our next Palabra Reclaim. And visit our website because we have a lot of good stuff coming up in the next few weeks. We have reporting coming from Honduras, from Guatemala, from all over the United States, in Espanol, in English. We keep working for you, trying to cover those stories that are not in the mainstream about our communities and by our reporters. So muchísimas gracias y big abrazo.